In our conclusion for Chapter 25, we will discuss the transport, storage, and elimination of urine. So here our focus will be on structures that are external to the kidney. So let's focus on the ureters for a second, because the ureters are situated between the kidney and the urinary bladder. These are slender tubes that are conveying urine from the kidney to the urinary bladder. They are a continuation of the renal pelvis, and they extend to the base of the urinary bladder. So if we go back to our diagram of the internal anatomy of the kidney, focus here on the renal medulla for a second, because the renal medulla is where the renal pyramids are. Recall that urine is leaving the collecting ducts and exiting the renal pyramids through the point of the pyramids that we call the papilla. That urine will flow into the minor calyces. Minor calyces deliver that urine to the major calyces, form essentially the merging points of several minor calyces here. The major calyces then deliver their urine to the renal pelvis, and the renal pelvis continues out of the kidney as the ureter. The ureter extends down to the base of the urinary bladder. So we see the ureters here as these thin tubes on the right and left side of the urinary bladder here. They connect to the urinary bladder at its base, and we find the openings at the base of the urinary bladder here. They're shown here as the uretic orifices. They form two parts to this three-part structure here called the trigon. So we have the two uretic orifices here, and the third structure that makes up the third part of the trigon here is the opening to the urethra in the urinary bladder here. So the urethra and the two uretic orifices form a triangular shaped structure at the base of the urinary bladder that we call the trigon. There are three layers in the walls of the ureter. The lumen is the internal cavity or space where urine would flow down to the kidney, down to the urinary bladder from the kidney. The mucosa is the layer that lines the lumen. The internal layer is a transitional epithelium. So remember, that's an epithelium that is specialized for stretching. So this epithelium allows the walls of the ureter to stretch. The transitional epithelium is attached to the underlying muscular layer by a connective tissue layer called the lamina propria. So the lamina propria is part of the mucosa, and it helps secure that transitional epithelium to the muscularis layer here. The middle layer is a smooth muscle layer called the muscularis that has essentially two subdivisions or two layers of smooth muscle. The longitudinal layer is the deeper of the muscularis layer, and it is smooth muscle that runs lengthwise down the ureter. The circular layer is a little bit more superficial, and this is a layer that runs circumferentially around close to the outside of the ureter wall. The reason why this muscularis layer is made out of smooth muscle is that the smooth muscle actually helps to contract and push or propel urine into the urinary bladder by peristalsis. So this is a pretty similar mechanism to what we saw in the small intestine for propelling food, because we see in the urinary bladder, or at least in the urinary system, that gravity is not sufficient to drive urine into the urinary bladder. So we have these layers of smooth muscle that are assisting in pushing the urine down into the urinary bladder. Finally, we have an outer fibrous connective tissue layer that makes up the most superficial wall of the ureter, and that's called the adventitia. So one of the problems that the ureters can encounter are they can encounter blockages from what we call renal calculi. We know these as kidney stones. These can block either the renal pelvis or the ureter, so they can physically obstruct flow out of the kidney into the urinary bladder. Kidney stones are caused by crystallized calcium or uric acid, which can become crystallized if they become too highly concentrated in the urine. So think chronic dehydration, or from dietary sources that are high in calcium, or uric acid production is high in the body. Then when these substances become highly concentrated in the urine, they can crystallize and form renal calculi or kidney stones that can block the flow of urine from the renal pelvis or the ureter. So that is the ureter. We'll turn our attention now to the urinary bladder, which is described as a muscular bag because there is, I think, no better description of anything in the world than describing something as a muscular bag. I guess when I think muscular bag, I'm picturing a shopping bag or something like that with some biceps, but it's just kind of a great picture here. Anyway, so the urinary bladder is for lack of a better description, a muscular bag that stores urine until it can be voided. The urinary bladder contains 3 openings in the base of it, that triangular-shaped region called the trigon. We saw the 2 ureters, the ureteric orifices, make up 2 of those openings at the base of the urinary bladder. The 3rd opening is the urethra, which will allow us to remove or will allow us to void the bladder and empty the urinary bladder when it becomes full. The trigon is actually a clinically important regions because this is where infections can persist, especially urinary tract infections, particularly in females because the female urethra is so much shorter than the male urethra. So the trigon is a clinically important region because this is where we see a lot of infections taking place, particularly from urinary tract infections. Similar to the ureters, the urinary bladder is a bag with 3 walls, or a sac with 3 layers or 3 walls in it. The mucosa is the layer that lines the lumen or the internal cavity of the urinary bladder. It's mostly composed of a transitional epithelium, which again is just like in the ureter, is a epithelium that's specialized for stretching. The muscular layer is called the detrusor. It's 3 layers of smooth muscle, and it's situated in the very center of the urinary bladder, so it makes up the middle layer of the layers of the urinary bladder. The superficial most or external layer is a fibrous layer called the adventitia. As far as storage capacity goes for the urinary bladder, the urinary bladder behaves fairly similarly to the stomach in that when it is full, it's able to distend or stretch, but when it is empty, it is able to collapse. And when it does collapse, we see these folds appearing in its walls called the rugae. So we saw those in the stomach as well. So these are the rugae, or the folding of the mucosa that occurs when the urinary bladder is empty. We saw the same structures in the stomach. We saw rugae in the stomach that also, in the mucosa of the stomach, that also fold when the stomach is empty as well. So we have some similarity there between the digestive system and the urinary system. As far as capacity goes, the urinary bladder holds roughly a half a liter, which is about 500 milliliters. When it's moderately full, it can hold 1,000 milliliters or 1 liter if necessary, but usually we will feel the need to void before that limit of 1,000 milliliters is reached. And just like the stomach, it can burst if it is overfilled. So that is the urinary bladder. Turning our attention to the urethra, which is a muscular tube that serves in draining the bladder, serves in voiding the bladder. It's going to also be pretty similar to the ureters as well. We see that the epithelium that lines the urethra is mostly pseudostratified epithelium. I say mostly here because it does change epithelial tissue types quite frequently. So near the part of the urethra that's near the urinary bladder or in close proximity to the urinary bladder is a transitional epithelium. So it's a similar epithelium type to the inner lining of the urinary bladder. Near the external urethral opening, which is furthest from the urinary bladder, closest to the outside world, if you want to think of it that way, the epithelium is a stratified squamous, which is consistent with our skin. The urethra has different anatomy depending on whether we're looking at the female urethra or male urethra. In females, the length also differs as well. In females, the urethra is about 4 centimeters long. In males, it's about 20 centimeters long. So we get differences in anatomy and length of the urethra, depending on whether we're looking at male or female. We have 2 urethral sphincters that control the flow of urine out of the urethra. We have the internal urethral sphincter, which is essentially a ring of smooth muscle. Recall that smooth muscle is involuntary, so our nervous system will control this automatically. So we don't have conscious control over this internal urethral sphincter. We do have conscious control over a urethral sphincter that's closest to the urethral opening, or I should say a little bit closer to the urethral opening than the internal urethral sphincter. The external urethral sphincter is skeletal muscle, so it is voluntary, or a voluntarily controlled muscle. And the external urethral sphincter gives us the ability to choose when we want to void the urinary bladder. Since we don't have control over the internal urethral sphincter, we at least do have some muscle that we can control here so that we have the ability to void the urinary bladder when it is convenient for us to avoid. So the urethral sphincters, as I mentioned, are ring-shaped masses of muscle that are in the walls of the urethra here. So if we look at an internal view of the urethra here, it's pretty much just a relatively straight muscular tube here. The internal urethral sphincter here is really at the boundary between the urinary bladder here and where the urethra begins here. So there is we've cut through it here, so you can't see that it is a ring-shaped mass. But this would be the location of the internal urethral sphincter that forms kind of a ring-shaped structure around this opening here. So when it contracts, it will close the internal urethral opening here. The external urethral sphincter is a little bit closer in proximity to the external urethral orifice here. It's actually situated in the wall of the urogenital diaphragm here. This is a ring of smooth muscle. Once again, you can't see that ring-shaped structure here because we've cut through it here. But it is a ring-shaped piece of smooth muscle that allows us to consciously or voluntarily close this urethral opening here, so that way we have control over when to void the urinary bladder, because we only want to avoid the urinary bladder when it is convenient. As I mentioned, we get anatomical differences in the female and male urethra simply because of the structures that they make their way through. The female urethra is actually bound to the anterior vaginal wall, so it appears as the opening to the urethra, or the external urethral orifice, actually appears as a small opening that is anterior to and a little bit above the vaginal opening. And so that's what we see here. This diagram here, is indicated down here, is a diagram showing the urinary bladder and urethra in females. The anatomy of the urinary bladder really doesn't differ too much with males. We simply have different structures with the urethra. The male urethra serves different purposes or functions than the female urethra. The female urethra is simply a duct or passageway for urine, whereas the male urethra serves as a duct for both urine and semen out of the body. So we'll discuss the production and release of semen when we get to the reproductive system chapters. The male urethra has 3 regions in it, where we only really saw one region in the female urethra. The 3 regions of the male urethra are the prostatic urethra, the membranous or intermediate part of the urethra, and then finally the spongy urethra. So the prostatic urethra is named because it passes through the prostate gland, and the prostatic urethra is closest in proximity to the urinary bladder itself. So the prostatic urethra is kind of the initial region of the male urethra. The membranous or intermediate part of the urethra actually passes through the urogenital diaphragm, so it makes up the middle or intermediate part of the urethra for males. The spongy urethra is also called the penile urethra because it's located within the erectile tissue of the penis. So looking at those 3 regions here, we have the urinary bladder, then we see the trigon here, we see the 2 ureteric orifices here. Those are the entrances of the ureters into the male urinary bladder here. This would be the entrance to the urethra here. The initial segment of the male urethra passes through this bulb-shaped gland here called the prostate gland. So this part is the prostatic urethra here. As the urethra passes through the urogenital diaphragm here, the urethra becomes the intermediate or membranous part of the urethra. And then the remaining length of the urethra makes its way through the erectile tissue of the penis, and so it is called the spongy or penile urethra. Finally, before terminating at the external urethral orifice. So we looked at the structures of the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. Now we'll talk briefly about how urination is achieved. So urination is also called voiding or micturition. And we see three events that have to happen in order for urination to occur. We have to see the detrusor muscle. Remember that the detrusor is the muscle that's in the wall of the urinary bladder of both the male and female urinary bladder. So we have to see the detrusor muscle contract. We have to see the opening of the internal urethral sphincter and the opening of the external urethral sphincter. So we have to have the pushing force of the detrusor muscle that's going to squeeze the urine out of the urinary bladder. And we have to have the urethral sphincters opening so that urine can flow from the urinary bladder and through the urethra. So let's look at how these three events are coordinated. And the best way to go about looking at the coordination of these three events is to look at it from the perspective of how urination occurs during infancy, because this is a reflexive process that we see in the body. So voiding events are kind of best understood by looking at how it occurs during infancy. So urination is signaled to our nervous system. The reflex for urination begins with bladder distension. So as the urinary bladder fills, it's going to distend or stretch. And this activates stretch receptors in the wall of the urinary bladder. This is going to send sensory information or sensory impulses to the sacral region of the spinal cord. The spinal cord will respond by sending visceral motor impulses. So remember, visceral motor is control of smooth muscle. And these visceral motor impulses are going to travel back and cause contraction of the detrusor muscle. So we're going to see contraction of the walls of the urinary bladder, and we're going to see relaxation of the internal urethral sphincter, since the internal urethral sphincter was smooth muscle. So that's going to contract the walls of the urinary bladder, force the urine out of the urinary bladder into the urethra, and open the internal urethral sphincter. The other thing that this reflexive response does is it inhibits the somatic nervous system. So it inhibits the skeletal muscle control over the external urethral sphincter. So remember, external urethral sphincter is skeletal muscle, so we can voluntarily control that. But during infancy, this reflex actually inhibits our ability to control it. And so the somatic nervous system is inhibited, and that allows relaxation and opening of the external urethral sphincter. So that will allow urine to flow out of the urinary bladder. So looking at this in a diagrammatic form here, if we turn our attention to this left side here, that kind of shows what's going on in terms of the reflex action of voiding the urinary bladder here. So we see that as the urinary bladder fills, it stretches. We see stretch receptors activated in the walls of the urinary bladder. That sends sensory information to the sacral region of the spinal cord, and we have a simple spinal reflex that's initiated to control this, where we get activation of the parasympathetic pathway. Remember, that's parasympathetic is the rest and digest division, so this promotes contraction of smooth muscle, and also allows us to maintain body functions like urination here. So parasympathetic activity is activated, sympathetic activity is inhibited. We also see somatic motor activity inhibited as well. So this reduces the ability of the body to control that external urethral sphincter. So with an increase in parasympathetic activity and a decrease in sympathetic activity, we see that the detrusor muscle, which lines the wall of the urinary bladder, contracts. The internal urethral sphincter actually relaxes and opens, and that allows micturition or urination to occur. If we come back to the inhibition of somatic motor activity, the reflex coming from the spinal cord inhibits our body's ability to to control that external urethral sphincter. That causes the external urethral sphincter to relax and open up, and also promote micturition here. So that's the case during infancy. So this is before higher brain centers have developed fully that allow us to override this signal. So this is a simple reflexive response that we see in infants here. One thing that we see occurring is that control centers in the brain, called the pontine control centers, start to mature between ages in 2 and 3. So pontine control centers are located in the pons of the brainstem, and they have control, or they can override the reflexive control of the spinal cord here. So this gives us, as we age and as our brain develops more, this gives us more control over when we can void the urinary bladder. So we have two places, or two control centers in the pons of the brainstem. We have the pontine storage center, which inhibits urination, and the pontine micturition center, which promotes urination. So the maturation of these two control centers allows us to a greater degree of voluntary control over when we want to void the urinary bladder. So also when we are older, we have greater control over the external urethral sphincter, which is skeletal muscle. So we can always delay voiding if voiding is not convenient at that particular time here. So let's go back and take a look at that diagram and see how the brain stem structures come into play in controlling this spinal reflex of urination. So once again, urinary bladder fills. That stretches the wall of the urinary bladder, activates the stretch receptors that send sensory information to the spinal cord, but also to the brain as well. So this is where the pontine control centers come into play. So they allow the inhibition, or they either permit or inhibit micturition as it's appropriate. So the pontine micturition center promotes voiding of the urinary bladder by doing the same thing that the spinal reflex did, in that it activated parasympathetic activity, inhibited sympathetic activity, and also it says that we have decreased control here over somatic activity, but now that our higher brain centers are a little bit better developed, we do have better control over that somatic activity, so it allows us to relax the external urethral sphincter and open it up, so that way we can void the urinary bladder. On the other hand here, the pontine storage center inhibits urination by acting on by decreasing parasympathetic activity, so that is going to delay the contraction of the detrusor muscle. That's going to cause the internal urethral sphincter to contract, so that way it closes the urethral opening. It allows us greater control over sympathetic activity and greater control over somatic motor activity as well. So that's a little bit about how the spinal cord and higher brain centers control the act of voiding the urinary bladder. So let's look at two homeostatic imbalances here. The first is urinary incontinence. So incontinence describes our ability to not contain urine within the urinary bladder. So urinary incontinence is typically a result of weakened pelvic muscles after childbirth or surgery. Stress incontinence is a type of incontinence that occurs after or when intra-abdominal pressure actually pushes urine through the external urethral sphincter and promotes voiding the bladder when voiding the bladder is not convenient for us. So things that increase intra-abdominal pressure are things like laughing, coughing, or sneezing, and these cause the external urethral sphincter to open even if we don't want it to open, because the external urethral sphincter and the walls of the urogenital diaphragm are weakened by things like pregnancy or surgery that gives us reduced control over our ability to choose when we want to void the bladder. Overflow incontinence describes incontinence during overfilling of the bladder. So that's ignoring the urge to void the bladder, the need to void the bladder, and so at that point, overflow incontinence. It really helps to avoid the urinary bladder, to avoid overfilling. On the other hand, urinary retention is the opposite of incontinence, where the bladder is unable to expel urine. One of the things that happens is that urinary retention is common after general anesthesia, because general anesthesia impairs the function of smooth muscle, particularly in the detrusor, and so it takes away the body's ability to control the detrusor muscle. And generally the control of the detrusor muscle is restored after anesthesia wears off. It can also occur in men if the prostate becomes enlarged or hypertrophied, because if the prostate becomes enlarged, then that closes or cinches the opening of the prostatic urethra, so that makes it much harder to avoid the urinary bladder. The treatment for this is to insert a small tube or a small catheter to allow drainage of the urinary bladder.